David is just all right with me. David is just all right. Oh, yeah. David is just all right with me. David is just all right. I probably won't get sued for that, right? David Fitzgerald, oh my God. It's been like maybe a month, but we're back. Welcome back to the Sacrilege cast.
Way too long to come back to the Zach.
We're doing our podcast version of subtweeting tonight. We're going to be discussing, many topics, I'm sure, but focusing on the Holy Kool Aid interview with Bart Erhman, about probably the longest interview I had ever seen him do on Jesus mythicism. I mean, he did that debate, but it was just questions about that topic, because usually when someone has him on, it's like new book, I got a webinar, whatever his latest and greatest is. But this was like 52 minutes of very concentrated discussion on one subject. And as soon as I saw it, the first person I thought about was, of course, you. So
I appreciate that. Yeah. And yeah, I just wanted to say right out of the gate, I freaking adore Bart Erhman. He's one of my favorite biblical scholars. And I've been saying for years that for a guy who is such a staunch historicist, he's one of the best mythicist scholars out there. And we were joking about this before the show, that I think one of my books down the road may have to be Bart Erhman versus Bart Ehrman on mythicism, and see how that goes.
Well, to prepare for tonight, so it's Bourbon Barrel Scottish ale night. So Backwoods Bastard. This is the year-round from Founders. You can probably get it where you're located. And then one of the best, this actually won a gold medal for best bourbon barrel, like Scottish ale. Like there's probably 10 in the whole country, but this is from Monday Night, which is local. It's funny. I keep posting Monday Night because the brewery actually started from a Bible study. So that would be fun to hang out with those guys. Yeah. Well, there's a lot of, there's a lot of breweries that have like biblically inspired. There's a brewery in town that's called Three Taverns. It's all like
too funny.
Inspired. There's a lot of stuff inspired by the Bible. So here we are.
Yeah.
In any case,
well, I bet alcohol did inspire some of the Bible itself. So it's kind of a vicious circle of it.
Well, as it, your Mormon connection was like, didn't they basically say no alcohol because they were broke and couldn't afford it, or was that not it? I know.
Yeah, it's funny how much
Joseph Smith.
It's funny how much alcohol was early. Sorry, I missed some of that.
I just meant.
I think we've got a bit of a time gap.
Yeah, there could be. My internet isn't the greatest, so I may just have to ask a question, like pause and go, "Did you get it? Are you still there?" Okay, good. Okay, well, this may or may not work really well because of the internet connection, but so I'm going to do, usual out of context guest quotes. Well, this is going to be out of context, maybe in context quotes from Bart Ehrman talking to Thomas of Holy Kool Aid. And the first quote has to be, let me make sure my audio is nice and up there.
Just read them. Of course, most people don't read them at all.
So yeah, it's just the laughter reaction that Bart Ehrman had to about every question was like before even, that set the stage beautiful. So here are the quotes he has. First one is "their stuff" with an exclamation point. I guess referring to there is backing to
so much stuff. Yeah.
I don't have a horse in the race, which I'm not sure about that one. But there's definitely
well, and to be fair, I don't feel like I have a horse in the race either. It's like if there was some sudden burst of new evidence that convinced me that Jesus really did exist, I would jump right out and write a book about that. No problem. And it's not like as atheists, Jesus has to be a myth for us to be atheists. It's like, we'll be just fine atheists if it just turned out he was a failed apocalyptic prophet or just some other kind of loser messiah of the first century. There's nothing implausible about that. But the fact is, I just don't see that's where our evidence takes us. And for what it's worth, that's why I keep pushing at this and saying, look, this doesn't add up. Because I have read them. That's why. Yeah.
Oh yeah, you've read. I mean, it's not. I was like asking in a joking way, like, "Hey, why don't you put all the Jesus books that you've read, behind you, which would probably fill like a room of where you live,
literally,
because there's just a density of content that you checked out." Okay, so the next one is how much evidence do you need, which we'll get into as the night goes on. And then everybody knew there was a man named Jesus. A man named Jesus.
That's yeah.
And the last one is it's a pile of stuff. It's a big pile. This was like, it's a big pile. Of course it is.
It is a big pile.
So one of the first questions, since part of my homework assignment was to actually I'd watched the video, but then I had to rewatch it and take notes, and it took a long time, was to get some good talking points that we get from someone who actually knows what they're talking about, like you. Yeah. So initially, one of the questions that Thomas asked that took a long time to get an answer was, how many actual sources are there about Jesus within a time frame that scholars accept? Because they set the foundation was set pretty well. It was like, well, this is something you learn as you kind of hear about history. Is like, well, actually, how do we know about any person in history, right? And he was covering the bases, but the sources were. So I'll just cover. These are the sources that he had by the time he actually wrote them all down. Was Mark, Q, L, M, John's sources, Acts, Paul's letters, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Thomas, Tacitus, and Josephus.
Yeah.
Now that's interesting.
I was a little surprised that he dragged out Josephus, because that's been beaten to death. And even he has said, even if every single word of this Testimonium Flavinium was true, it's just saying what Christians were repeating at the time. So it's worthless as historical evidence. And nobody thinks every word of that is true. Nobody thinks that. Even the evangelicals are saying, well, I'm sure he wrote something and the Christians, tampered with it, not realizing how bad that makes them look and how bad that makes this evidence, or, how dodgy that makes it at all. But yeah, I'm not surprised that the Christians keep bringing up Josephus, because if you take Josephus out of the equation, they have nothing to corroborate the New Testament for the whole first century or more. But that said, I don't see why atheists read the Testimonium and don't realize all the problems with it, that clearly a Jew did not write this. Clearly, the fact that it doesn't get mentioned for 500 years when people were mentioning Josephus all the time in Christian circles, that's a huge problem. And the second so-called reference to Jesus in Josephus is not talking about our Jesus at all. It makes no sense if it was our Jesus. And it clearly tells you which Jesus it's talking about. Like the man says, you just have to read it. Then it makes sense. Then that little snippet of a fragment saying who is called the Christ makes perfect sense as just a line fragment.
As one of, would you be saying this with, him watching you?
Gotcha.
The cartoon is just great. The cartoon version of our.
Yeah, I thought they did great. I thought Thomas did a great job.
I mean, to do that stuff, to do videos, first of all, the editing part, but then to kind of edit the mouth movements, and that's a fantastic job. Something that's impressive. Well, we can schedule it. All right, we'll do the Josephus part. I was gonna go,
but let's talk. Well, let's talk about some of those other ones.
I mean, the thing about the Josephus is there. So Josephus was a Jewish historian who quit, who basically went to the Roman side because it's he was. What was he, a general? I don't even know what but his everybody below him committed suicide, and so he said, okay, I'm going. He went to the Romans, and then he wrote history.
by the way, that suicide story he tells is super dodgy, super dodgy.
Well, I mean,
But
yeah,
anyway,
it's like,
yeah.
yeah.
We all
It's funny, like
committed
every
suicide except-
aspect of every story, you're like, oh, wait a second.
Yeah,
I say,
yeah.
let's see if I can copy
But
this.
anyway. Well,
I mean, there are two mentions. So there are two mentions in the book.
Yeah.
And they talked about both of them, and I don't even know if it helps to like share, since you probably know it by like heart by now.
Well, yeah, I spent a whole chapter.
This is the version that he kind of highlighted, like the the whole part, time man named Jesus, and the part that's highlighted in red is what Ehrman says is not, and I think this is the first mention, and I think was it chapter 18? I can't remember the book
it's
that it's
from. Antiquities of the Jews, yeah.
Mm-hmm. But in any case, Ehrman is like, hey, this came out, and then it's interesting when they come up with like, here's how we know why this isn't true. Like he said, he was the Christ. A Jewish person wouldn't say that someone was the Savior. Okay.
Right.
And then, he makes references to the prophecies. I mean, after all, this is only like one paragraph in, 20 volumes the guy wrote?
Right. And this one paragraph doesn't match anything else before it or after it in the context of the chapter it's in. In fact, the next line after this says, and then this time there was another great calamity. It's like, wait a second, great calamity? You just had a commercial for Jesus. There's no great calamity here. Unless you go back to before this starts, when he was describing a calamity. And again, regardless of the way they've switched around the goalposts to say, oh, well, it was partially forged, or it was, we've got evidence, all these evidence of these other versions of the testimony, they all come back to ultimately derive from the same source, Eusebius, who appears to be the actual forger. And we can spend a whole show just about that. But like I said, I spent a whole chapter on that. But let's keep moving, because we got a lot to cover tonight, because there's so much. So much.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to talk about sources, but I kind of wanted to go with the Gospels first. Like, I mean, one of the first arguments that Thomas brought up that was almost like, sometimes he brought up things that I knew were like kind of softballs. Like he knew, like, okay, this is a fastball down. This is exactly where Ehrman wants to hit the ball right here. Yeah. So he mentioned that it was kind of like Mythicists thought that like all four Gospels counted as one source, and how that was not true. And it's like,
right. And that's a strange thing for me to hear him say, because I mean, the synoptic problem is the fact that all three of the first Gospels are clearly taken from Mark and expanded on. And there's different theories to account for that, but nobody denies that at the heart of it, all four of our canonical Gospels ultimately derive from this first Gospel that's the most low-rent, fallible human Jesus, and seems to be a complete allegory, 100% taken from Old Testament scriptures and other sources, but primarily Old Testament sources, to create an allegorical figure. And when you talk about M, when you talk about L, these are all hypothetical sources that we don't even know existed. And if they did exist, we don't know what they said. We don't even know if they're originally about Jesus at all. We've got Nag Hammadi scriptures like the Sophia of Jesus Christ that are taken from pagan documents. And somebody is literally cut and pasting a pagan tract and putting it in the mouth of Jesus and his disciples, word for word in major chunks of it. It's a total smoking gun. So again, Raphael Lattister, in his book, Did Jesus Exist? In his critique of Did Jesus Exist, calls Ehrman out on this, that he's relying on sources that we don't even know if they exist. What seems to be the case for people like Farrar and Mark Goodacre and a whole school of scholarship on this synoptic problem is that what we call Q, the source gospel, which we also is a hypothetical gospel, that is just where Luke is stealing from Matthew and Mark. Matthew's stealing from Mark. Luke is stealing from Matthew and Mark. And just from an Occam's razor standpoint, that makes sense. So when Bart specifically said, well, maybe Matthew is stealing from Mark and Luke is stealing from Matthew, but there's good reason not to think so, I was like, whoa, pump the brakes. I would love to hear some of your reasons for that. And I have heard, to be honest with you, but there's whole schools of thought from historians, biblical historians, who say that these things that were not just pretending to see in the scriptures, they may not have existed at all. You know, they may just be where Luke is stealing from Mark and Matthew.
I mean, that's the interesting aspect is like you have, and plus I feel bad for John's sources. Like you wouldn't even get a letter for that. Like there's QLM, but there's just John's sources. Like,
well,
okay,
because there's a thing called the sign source.
Plus, it was what was it? It was a few years later when John came out compared to the first three, right?
Exactly.
At least as far as people guess. But it's just intriguing because there is. There are actual books that like Christians wrote that were like against people who are attacking like the Bible, and it's like, well, attacking people who talked about Jesus.
Yeah.
And they actually quote the book. So you're like, well, there must have been a book that they came from, but with QLM, John's sources, that kind of stuff, like we don't have it. All we have are the idea of like, well, these two statements in Luke and Matthew are similar, if not exactly the same. And that's hard to believe it's a coincidence. So it must come from a third source, but we still don't have the source.
And there's another yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. But there's another thing about the borrowing from Matthew and Mark. There's things like intercalation, which is a literary phenomenon that Mark is very fond of. He does it at least 6 times that we can count. And he may have done it other times that are not as certain. But all it means is he takes 2 events and he sandwiches one within the other. So it starts over here, cuts to another scene, and then goes back to the original scene. There's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing sinister about it. It's just a literary style that he likes to use. But the thing about it for our purposes is when suddenly Matthew and Luke interrupt their scenes in exactly the same spot, word for word often, we're realizing that this is a direct borrowing from Mark. And there's not a whole lot of ways except for incredible coincidence if that wasn't the case.
Well, this is something I may have asked when we talked about, Jesus mything in action, but I mean, one of the considered like sources from that time period, or at least type of sources, would be like oral tradition. And of course, oral stories from time to time, people like had the assumption that like, oh, people actually memorize things better in oral tradition than not. And when you actually play the telephone game, you realize that isn't true. Is there actually a way as a historian, as someone who studies historians anyway, like to fingerprint an oral source? Like, could you actually figure out, hey, this is an oral source for maybe one of the Gospels?
I thought that was a really good question when I saw it in your notes. And the thing about it is, to reverse that question, you can't really do that for oral source in a way that I'm familiar with, because either you have an oral source that's gotten written down, at which point it's no longer an oral source, or you don't. But you, on the contrary, you can take a source that's purportedly an oral source and show that, oh, nope, that's a literary source, because here's the literary source he's taking it from. Or he's changing this around, but it's clearly taken from here. And in the case of the Gospels, well, just to jump back to John for a second, he talks about John's sources. Well, we know John, like all the other Gospels and most of the epistles as well, actually all the epistles, have been edited and re-edited. And it's especially obvious in John because we have, and Mark too for that matter, we have different endings for John. With our Gospel of John, you can read the Gospel and see where it ends, and then see where someone's added on another thing, and then see where they've added on a third thing. And you can just read that for yourself just by reading the last chapters of John. There's a thing called the sign source in John that he used where this miracle worker who was probably Jesus, but we don't know, maybe the sign source really wasn't about Jesus. Anyway, that material has him doing his first sign and doing his second miraculous sign. But it's been put into John's gospel in such a way that you have him saying things like, and then he went over here and did more signs, and then he did his third sign. It's like, whoa, pump the brakes. You just said this was his first sign or his second sign. But there's material padded in between these that have more miracles that aren't part of the sign, these miraculous signs. And there's another example where he has Jesus at the Last Supper say, okay, come on, let's go now. And then he talks for another 2 chapters, So it's very obvious when you look at that, when you look at the multiple endings we have of Gospels like Mark and multiple versions of Matthew and Luke, for that matter. We've got edited and re-editing redactions going on. But that doesn't mean we have independent sources. That means that they are reworking material. And we don't know if there's original material. There's so many assumptions that, this all came from oral tradition. But everything we see in these looks like literary functions. It does not look like oral tradition. There's structures to it that are literary. It looks like it's literary right out of the box, right from the word go.
I mean, I think the book that Ehrman's working on next is about Revelation. And he's talking about the book of Revelation in terms of people did not take it literally at the time, and it was not meant to be taken literally at the time.
Yeah, it was.
But now it's being taken literally by some people. Well, it's been taken literally for a long time.
And the funny thing about Revelation is everyone's sure it's talking about their generation. It's talking about, the Antichrist is this or that. And the idea of what the Antichrist or Antichrists were and are, changes throughout Christian history too. The idea that we have today that he's like some kind of anti-Jesus who's this Machiavellian Illuminati king of the world, evil dude, that came out of the 70s. That's not an old idea at all. Hitler was Antichrist. The Sultan of Turkey was an Antichrist. Nero is the original Antichrist, really. But you've got early Christians talking about how there are more than one Antichrist, and anybody who doesn't believe this or says this, they are Antichrists. So, like everything else in Christianity, those terms and those concepts change over time and evolve.
I mean, I can relate to Christians in a way that they want the revelation to be during their lifetime. Like, I want the Tennessee Titans to win their first Super Bowl during my lifetime, but it might just not happen. And, I just have to accept that that's a possibility.
It's kind of amazing that the fear mongering that's kind of inherent in that this is the end of the world and Jesus is going to come back any time now. And they've been pulling that trick for 2,000 years plus. And it always seems fresh and plausible to whatever guys have decided that, the COVID shot is actually the mark of the beast. I don't know how you make a connection like that, except that the evil liberal government is pushing it on you. So it must therefore be the mark of the beast. But you can't find any idea remotely like that in Revelation. So,
well, you're living in socialist California, so I can't even trust what you're saying.
Right?
How do I?
Just want you to think. Yeah.
I had the 3rd shot last week, and I am still alive.
Oh,
so
no.
I don't know if that's good or bad.
Well, it beats getting Omicron or Delta.
Yeah. Well, one of the concepts that came up early in the interview was that. When you're looking at a source in history, you're looking at any potential biases they have.
Sure.
Well, one of the questions that came up during the interview was, what about the religious biases of the authors of the Gospels? Bart Ehrman did say that, the people who wrote these books didn't think they were going to become the Bible part 2. But at the same time, they had they were definitely trying to,
because the people who edited it certainly did. The people who edited it said, no, this is going to be scripture. In fact, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, not their real names, they weren't trying to set out to write 4 different gospels. they were all setting out to write the one true gospel. You know, and the story of how our New Testament came together is a lot wiggier than that even. But I mean, to say that there's no bias in these writers, it's like that just blew my mind. It's like, how do you really believe the words that are coming out of your mouth?
The comparison he made was you couldn't trust someone who wrote about Abraham Lincoln because it was an American, and I'm like, what? Is that the same thing? Like,
yeah, I was just baffled by.
I mean, obviously, people writing about Lincoln now probably are giving a bit of a rosy picture of who he was, but at the same time, you probably trust the people who lived when he lived, what they wrote about him. And he had, I mean, unlike Jesus and all the people involved in the Bible, you have his writings and you have some of what he said. That's good. Yeah, it would be a nice thing to have.
Yeah, and yet the thought that these guys who wrote these things to sell this new religion did not have a bias in selling that new religion. That whether there's a Jesus or not, that makes no sense to me whatsoever. To say, oh, we can still trust them because they, you know, their bias isn't not anything to worry about. It's like, well, okay.
I mean, you have to at least think that could be a possibility instead of
well, if they were telling the truth, if they were all telling the same story, maybe, sure. But it's like when John tells a completely different story from Mark, and when Matthew and Luke are copying from somebody else and saying, look, I've investigated and now I'm going to give you the real scoop because so many people are writing gospels now, as Luke does in the beginning of his gospel. It's like, and then he goes and steals from Matthew and Mark. It's like, wow, it's not just bias. There's like some serious fabrication going on. Not to mention plagiarism.
Well, I'm not good in terms of like the books of the Bible itself, but so there are two that are not in the Bible that are considered sources from at least this interview.
And that's
Gospel of Peter and Gospel of Thomas. I know Gospel of Thomas is like sayings of Jesus.
Yeah. Let's take those both one at a time because they're both.
These were discovered fairly, like these were not discovered like early, right?
Early 20th century, I think, for Gospel of Thomas, I want to say, or possibly late Victorian, but yeah, very recent compared to all the others. But let's talk about the Gospel of Peter for a second, because first of all, that story is clearly evolving from the other earlier Gospels that we know of. And it includes things like a 500-foot tall Jesus and 250 tall angels and a cross that comes out of the tomb and starts talking. It's like there's some crazy wackadoodle stuff.
That was the talking cross.
That's cool. The Gospel of Peter. And yet we're supposed to think that, oh no, there was a source for that. And like, really? That 500 feet tall Jesus and the talking cross, you think that's coming from some independent source that somehow has any historical value. I'm just, okay, whatever.
Do we know the relative time frame of Peter and Thomas?
Well, we do know that Peter, when it came out, was probably much more popular than Mark's. In fact, to be honest, I think we are lucky to have Mark's gospel at all, because Matthew was setting out to replace it. Luke was setting out to replace it. And we have 3 times as many copies of the Gospel of Peter from that we do of the Gospel of Mark, from the early parts of Christianity. So yeah, it's an interesting situation.
Well, why didn't it make the cut?
Well, there's so many Gospels and epistles and acts that didn't make the cut. It's just what made the cut depended on what your faction liked and how much political power your faction had, basically, is what it comes down to. And of course, it took a long time to sort out that argument too. And before Marcion came along and wrote his Apostolicon, that was like the theological Sputnik, as Robert Price says, that said, oh, he just collected all these old scriptures. We should do that too. And so we wouldn't have a New Testament. Nobody thought to collect a New Testament before this heretic in the 2nd century put together his collection of early Christian scriptures and epistles. So it was such a weird higgly-piggly affair, that came together with not any real sense of control. And there's so many other gospels, acts, and writings of the time that we know about, and even more of that we know existed but didn't survive to the day. So there's we just see the tip of the iceberg of Christian writings when it comes down to what survived.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, they were talking about the Josephus, how the book probably only survived because Christians kept it, even though it didn't really talk about Jesus that much. But yeah, it's interesting, like what survived and why. Yeah. Like, what books do we not have because someone's like, not important.
Right. Yeah, and I talk a little bit about that in Nailed. It's interesting you say that about Josephus, because one of the early Christian fathers complains about Josephus not mentioning Jesus, and saying, he should have blamed the destruction of Jerusalem on the fall of Jesus. But, in that, like a Jew, he just ignores Jesus completely. And the ironic thing about that is that church father was the same guy whose copy of Josephus came down to Eusebius, who suddenly discovers this thing that no one's ever seen before or since for another 200, 300 years, the Testimony of Flavinium. It's like, how come it wasn't in Origen's copy? Because it clearly wasn't, because he was complaining about exactly that. And there you still, there's that.
It's amazing what, it's like sometimes amazing what we have and then what we don't. But one of the kind of softball questions that came to Ehrman was, I'll just throw this to you and see how it goes. Why do mythicists think that Nazareth didn't exist? I had to do it. I probably would be here for that one.
Again and again, it drove me crazy that he says, all mythicists think, boom, the exact same thing, and then throw some crazy ass thing. Like, and to be fair, yeah, there are mythicists who think Nazareth didn't exist. Renee Salm did a really good job in his book of giving the arguments why it's not a slam dunk that Nazareth existed. I tend to think that it probably did exist in that time, but honestly, I'm agnostic about it because we have so many bigger issues to fry when it comes to Jesus that trying to pin down whether Nazareth exists or not, I don't think we have enough evidence to slam dunk either direction. And even if we could, one way or the other, it doesn't necessarily change the rest of the evidence on historicity. It could just mean that whoever wrote the Gospels had never been to Nazareth, at best, which is probably true anyway. So I think there's a limited utility trying to figure out that. Same thing with like the arguments of, well, was the cross T-shaped, or was it capital T-shaped, or was it some other shape, or was it just this? It's like those questions of what the cross really like kind of falls into the whole, what was the historical Jesus really like? It's like there's a certain point where no one can say, and it doesn't really matter because it's all made up anyway.
Well, I think it was like almost as soon as that question was asked in the video, then Thomas posted that like Nazareth only was the Jesus like origin story in one of the four Gospels. So I feel like it was
actually, I'm glad you brought that up because
there was the Bethlehem Nazareth thing. So
yeah, and I talk about the whole Bethlehem versus Nazareth thing in Jesus Mything in Action. But
you should read that book, people. Read the books.
I'm just saying, yeah. The thing about Jesus of Nazareth, especially in Mark, despite the way our Bibles read, he never actually says Jesus of Nazareth. He says Jesus the Nazorian or Jesus the Nazarene, words that mean something very different. And yeah, there are versions of that word that can mean somebody from a village like Nazareth or Nazareth, but it's a sect name. It's a name for a group. and a group leader. In fact, we have it in the New Testament and other places when Paul's accused of being a ringleader of the Nazorians. And there's this whole constellation of all these different meanings of words that people like McGrath, who I don't always agree with very often, but he makes a great argument that, yeah, they don't really say Jesus of Nazareth. It's a sect rule. And it's like, when he's right, he's right. And yeah, absolutely. We could go a lot further in that too, but that's the nuts and bolts of that. Is no one was saying that that's where he was from, at least in Mark's gospel.
Yeah, it was like taking down an argument that people weren't even making. But
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we're actually going a little back in time. So Ehrman mentioned this was a debate about whether Paul thought Jesus was celestial being versus Jesus being a real being. And Ehrman said that Paul thought Jesus was real because he mentioned real events like the Last Supper, which I'm sure you might have something to say about. And then he talked to James, Jesus' brother, which, I mean, you can't talk to the brother of a guy who existed, right?
His donkey laugh when he brings that up all the time. It's like, dude, we know what it says there. You know, the brother of the Lord, and especially all the problematic elements of Galatians in there, because it's like, he says something to the effect of, I didn't see any apostles except for James, the brother of the Lord. But the grammar of that could also mean, I didn't see any apostles. I only saw James, the brother of the Lord. And again, there's ways in Greek to say Jesus' brother of the Lord, and as it's used there and in other cases, seems to be a sect title as well. And in fact, he often refers to Christians as brothers of the Lord, but specifically he refers to a group, the brethren of the Lord, who get to take sister wives with them, and he doesn't, and he complains about that. But again, this is probably the closest for the historians. This is probably the closest that you can point to something and say, well, this is Paul talking about a real life person in Jesus's entourage. Unless you kept reading a little few verses later and realize that he's talking about the leaders of the Jerusalem church as if they're fake Christians, as if they have no connection to Jesus at all. And he's not even sure that they're real believers. He opposes them. And a few verses later, he's fighting Peter face to face and says things like, you know, I didn't give in to them for a second. I called them out. But at no point in Paul's letters does he ever say these guys were Jesus' disciples. In fact, he never uses the word disciples ever in any context whatsoever. And when he talks in Corinthians about who's the hierarchy of the church, he says, well, at the top, of course, there's apostles like me and guys like Apollonius of Alexandria and Janaeus and other Greek, his other rival preachers. You know, those are what apostles are: people who have had a vision of the risen Lord or found him by hunting through the Scripture. That's what he says an apostle is. And then he goes on this laundry list of, and then you've got exorcists, you've got helpers, you've got faith healers, blah, 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 blah. At no point in that laundry list does he ever talk about Jesus's disciples, Jesus's relatives. Those categories don't exist for him when he's describing the early church. And even when we read Acts, those names that are supposedly Jesus's friends and family, they disappear from the story instantly. After the first chapter of Acts, and we don't have any information about them at all. It's bizarre to me, the absence of any kind of context for who the disciples were and who the 12 were. He describes the 12 at a time when there were only supposed to be 11, and
there was one that might have not done so well.
Yeah. And that whole chapter and verse is just a laundry list of the people who claimed or were known to have had mystical visions of the risen Lord. And he, in that list, it's weird that he talks about the 12, and then he talks about the apostles. as if they're different groups. And again, elsewhere, he never connects apostles with 12 apostles, 12 disciples. So it's very weird. In fact, in that same laundry list, when we go a little further, I should say a little bit before that, he talks about how he knows Jesus was crucified and how he knows Jesus was raised from the dead. It's not because any of his disciples told him that. He constantly tells us he didn't learn his gospel from any man, but directly from scripture and from revelations of Jesus. But he says he was crucified according to the scriptures. He rose on the third day according to the scriptures. That's how he always says how he knows and why he's an apostle is because he found it in the scriptures and God told it to him, spoke him to his ear, you know. He had visions. Another fun fact about that whole laundry list there is none of it matches anything in any of our gospels. It's like, wait, where's the women at the tomb? Where's he appeared to the two guys on the road to Emmaus? You know, where there's nothing that matches anything in our gospels. It's such a weird thing that they hold up as proof positive that the gospels are speaking the truth, and it doesn't match anything we have in our gospels. So bizarre.
And it was like another kind of Josephus like argument. Like Paul wouldn't think that Jesus was a cosmic being because he was a Jew, but it was like, well, he wasn't a Jew after he got converted, right? So he believed.
I mean, the whole point is people like my brand of mythicism, if you will, Richard Carey and Bart Price, we're saying that looks like Christianity started as a mystery faith, a Jewish version of the mystery faith. And Mark's allegorical Jesus, or for that matter, the Jesus in the book of Hebrews, who does all this stuff in heaven. And it specifically says, now, if this had been on earth, it would have been a whole different story. The book, the Ascension of Isaiah, has got a Jesus moving through back and forth, up and down through the heavens in this celestial way that is disconnected from earth. Jews talked about a celestial Messiah. We've got it in our New Testament. We even have verses in our Old Testament that were used to bring that figure to life. But you can't say that. And besides, the first century, Judaism was never more diverse than it was in the start of the first century. There was like 18 factions that we know of, and probably more than that as well. Let's not belabor that point either.
There's so many points.
So that's the thing. Once you start looking at this stuff, they all just start tumbling out of the bag, and it's like there's so much to unpack because everything is problematic. But let's keep going because I know you've got a better laundry list than I do of what went on in there.
We're just gonna get the only thing to fear is fear itself. The only thing to fear is mythicism itself.
Right.
This was an interesting argument for someone who says he's an atheist, was that the idea that Jesus didn't exist is a dumb idea because the actual idea that Jesus didn't exist didn't come up until the Enlightenment, until the 18th century, and the people who brought it up were immediately dismissed as crackpots. I wonder why. Well,
first of all, that's just not true. That's just simply not true. And Robert Price has talked about this too, is like Christians act like this was all debunked in the 19th century, or the 17th century even. And it's like, no, they're just harumphed. They're just harumphed, ignored, and they're laughed at like a jackass, just the way Ehrman did. And for what it's worth, biblical studies 50 years ago, when Thomas Thompson was arguing that Moses and the patriarchs probably didn't exist, his career almost died right on the vine before it ever began. And now, by the 90s, that's the majority consensus view among secular scholars. And even in some evangelical institutions, they're admitting that, Moses didn't happen, that Exodus didn't happen. And the same questions, the same responses at that time are sounding exactly like what Bart and company say today. It's like, oh no, this is ridiculous. Oh, no serious scholars say this. Yeah, just total poo-poo it. And yet, when you look at all the questions throughout biblical history, you know, they are constantly eroding that foundation. Stuff that Bart is saying now would have been laughed at 50 years ago. You saw how much pushback he got when he was writing in the 90s from Christians. And the thing is, they weren't saying he was wrong. They were just saying he was being mean to them, or he was just taking it too far. So I don't know what the responses were fact-wise, because none of them seem to ever say, no, he's mistaken about that. They all just say, well, yeah, but blah, 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 blah. It was fascinating to see.
Well, that's when people hear about like Mother Teresa and you say, hey, Mother Teresa was pretty bad. And then you're like, people are like, but I've heard that Mother Teresa has been great my entire life. It's like, yeah. You've heard a lot of stuff that might not be true. I mean, the argument that Ehrman had was like, he's like, well, people in the 1st century, 2nd century weren't saying that Jesus didn't exist. And I was like, wait, you're an atheist. Like, people weren't saying that gods didn't exist in the 1st and 2nd century.
Well,
so clearly,
and you know what? And here's the thing. That's not even true. We've got Justin Martyr writing his book, The Dialogue with Trypho, where sure, Trypho's an imaginary character, but he's a placeholder for all the arguments that was being thrown at him from Jews and pagans at the time. And he puts these words in his mouth that he actually says, well, no one's seen Jesus if he existed ever or anywhere. So it looks like you Christians have invented this Christ for yourself and are dying for nothing. It's like, boom, it could not be more explicit. And that's in the 2nd century. These arguments are coming. And we know there are critics like Porphyry and the Emperor Julian and Celsus who were digging on the problems with the stories in the gospel that just couldn't be true. But we don't have their writings. We only have the Josh McDowell versions, the Lee Strobel versions of them responding to their arguments. Or indeed, maybe they're just making straw man arguments. But we don't have their actual words. We only have quotes of them in Christian heresy hunting manuals and apologetics. But even with that, we know at least one. We do have examples of people saying, we don't even know if Jesus existed, you know.
But I don't know. Ehrman said otherwise. It's interesting argument because he said like the mythicists hated God, and I'm like, isn't that something that William Lane Craig would say to like an atheist? Like, you hate God. It's like, we're not sure that God exists.
Or we're out to write books and sell money. He's like, yeah, I'm a writer. I write books to sell money. Yes, to get money. That's exactly right. But why did I write the book? It's because I think this is true, and these arguments are not being addressed. Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
There's just
I keep biting my tongue because it's like I can keep talking about this for another 5 minutes, or we can move on to the next one. But it's funny, and again, we'll be perfectly fine as atheists if it turned out there was a real Jesus, and I will be the first to say, "Hey, there was a real Jesus." But it keeps going in the other direction. It's like further and further. It seems like, oh yeah, that couldn't have happened. Of all the things that never happened, this never happened the most. It's like none of this happened. And it seems more and more obvious that that's the case. And lest you think I'm just picking on Jesus, I feel the same way about every single other religion I've looked into. And so far I've looked at the top 12 world religions, and they all seem to suffer from the same weird, dodgy backstory for their founder figures. It's fascinating, really fascinating to me.
I'm going to say right now, you need to start studying the cult of Trump. He's going to be some kind of god, and well, he's already a god, but I mean, he's going to be like.
But here's
they're going to make it like a mythos version of him.
QAnon is the closest thing we've got to a mythical founder figure of the Trump cult, because he's this prophet in the wilderness that is a Washington insider, or and he does not exist. He never did exist, and yet people are attacking the White House because Q sent me. It's like you could not have a better example of how this this mythological founding figure story continues even today. It's happening right now as we speak all across America.
Well, I feel like by the time this podcast version comes out, JFK Jr. will have come back and we'll be eating our words. So that's out there.
There you go. There you go. Yeah. And I don't know where to laugh or cry about stuff like that, because it's the thing that scares me the most about that movement is it is fact proof. It is rationality proof. It is reason proof. And it's not just stupid, but it's mean too. And that's mean and stupid is a really bad combo. Really bad combo.
It's like allowing people to be, hey, it's okay to be bigots and it's okay to like hate and be negative. And and they're like super, most of them are trying to be like super Christians. Like,
yeah.
Marjorie
and
Taylor
Greene, at the same time. It's bizarre to me. It's bizarre to me. Yeah, but we're getting down a whole other rabbit hole too.
Oh, there are so many rabbit holes possible.
So many.
But I want to talk about like what you have going on, because I feel like you have like YouTube stuff happening. You have like a Mormon series going on. You got a new book you're working on.
I do. Yeah.
What are you up to? I want to hear about your stuff.
Yeah. What have I been doing? So yeah, you're right. There's been a Mormon podcast on the Myth Vision series that I did with Bryce Blankenagel of Naked Mormonism, where we did the secret history of Mormonism. And it's been such a blast. It's so much fun to see how different Mormonism looked in the early 1800s than it did, any other time since. And man, HBO, I hope they're watching that, because that could be such a Game of Thrones for them. There's so much sex and violence.
So many seasons.
So much sex and violence in early
Mormon history.
It's fascinating. I think I told you earlier before the show, I've been working on a book, Sex and Violence in the Bible. It's based on my talk that you can see on YouTube. It's probably my most popular talk I've ever given. And it's super fun talking about all the craziness in the Bible. And I tried to keep it to just like the creme de la creme. I couldn't do like an encyclopedia, all the crazy stuff in the Bible. I just tried to get the most, the cream of the crop for that. And yet it's still taken a long time because there's just so much. And I think one thing I'm going to be doing is taking what I was going to have in the book and making a completely separate book, because when you talk about the dates and the times that these books were written, there's people like Russell Gmerkin who are making the argument that the Old Testament is a lot younger in places than we think it is, much younger. And so there's a lot to unpack there. I gave a talk for the Freedom from Religion Foundation and the Global Center for Religious Research recently on the historical Jesus. And I brought up the point, and forgive me if I'm rehashing something I already said on this show, but making the point that as a side effect of looking into the history question for Jesus, I would get contacted by Buddhists, and I get contact by ex-Muslims who were saying, yeah, we're having the exact same debates in our circles on whether the Buddha existed or whether Muhammad existed. And that blew my mind, because Muhammad was just 7th century. I mean, we've got his family trees. And the more they start saying, yes, because this, and this, it's like, oh yeah, we've got Jesus' family tree too. Yeah, we've got all these other things. And when they were saying the problems that we have with our sources in Islam, it sounded a lot like when we're talking about the problems with our sources in Jesus. So much so that I've been saying, it looks like every religion I've looked into, and so far it's 12 and counting, all the biggies have the same exact problem of imaginary founder figures, or it certainly seems like they're imaginary founder figures. And I've also been doing, I did a article with Vale Tarico about that. And the part 2 will be talking about the evolution of world religions and the stages that they all seem to go through, whether we're talking about Mongolia or South America or the Pacific Islands or, ancient Mesopotamia or Europe. There's all these stages we get at various levels of development, including pre-human development and early cavemen, Neolithic times. And it's fascinating to see that even though the theology changes and the rules change and the gods aren't the same, the structures of world religions follow an amazingly similar path, depending on what level of agriculture you're at, what size of a tribe you're at. Do you have a shaman yet? Do you just have, storytellers? It's fascinating to see how the structure grows and evolves in the same ways, no matter which group you're talking about. It's fascinating.
I mean, you just have so much research.
It's all kinds of stuff. I am hoping to have the sex and violence book out soon, soonish. But it's been a crazy year, and a lot of stuff has been popping up. And,
to even say it's been a crazy year is,
you're
like, oh yeah, I'm with you on that one.
And it's not all even in bad ways. It's just it was crazy for all these other developments that surprised me so much that I felt like I had to do talks about them. But getting back to the sex and violence, there's some crazy stuff that I've never. I kind of stumbled on. I wanted to touch on them, and yet the deeper I went, it's like I've never heard anybody saying this before at all. Look at how crazy it is. Dragons in the Bible, giants in the Bible. I thought I knew all about dragons and giants in the Bible. There's so much more. There's so much more to be dug up just about those two monsters. It's amazing. There's a Jewish 5th century group in Egypt at an island called Elephantine, and we have 100 years or more of correspondence with them. And the Jews of Elephantine are like no other group of Jews before or since. They don't seem to know anything about Moses, anything about their Passover is something completely different. It's like a harvest festival. They worship 3 gods in their temple. And they're not some radical, weird mutant heresy sect. They're on great terms with the Jerusalem temple because we have all their letters exchanged back and forth. We still have them. It blows my mind. It just blows my mind. So much stuff to talk about. All these rabbit holes. Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's so many books and words in the Bible itself, but then just the list of apocrypha that Thomas posted in the Nag Hammadi books.
Yeah.
Even to read those and then to analyze them is just it's like and lifetimes.
If we had never discovered the Nag Hammadi books from the 3rd century, 4th century, we would have no idea how crazily diverse and wiggy Christianity was 300 years after the fact. It's mind-blowing, just mind-blowing. That these people thought themselves as Christians, and yet nothing they're saying looks anything like what we think of as Christian. Yeah.
But as fans of yours, when will the sex and violence book what's the time frame on when we might see it?
Probably sometime in the next year. Won't be done this month, but it will be. I think it will be done next year, and hopefully soon.
In terms of publishing, that's pretty soon.
Yeah, we'll say. One of the other fun, crazy life things that was my wife and I finished our science fiction trilogy, Time Shards trilogy. That the last book just came out this year, long after we thought it would, but still it came out. And if there's any science fiction fans out there who like, for instance, the time travel stuff that was in Jesus Mything in Action, I think you'll really dig Time Shards because it's probably the only science fiction time travel mashup that has been written by somebody who gets into biblical studies from an atheist perspective. And there's a lot of fun in there, especially for you heretics out there.
Yeah, you should check it out. And you should check out the last interview we did because we talked about spoilers.
Yeah.
For the people who had actually...
I'm glad you reminded me that there has just been a lot of crazy ass stuff going on.
I mean, it's just your life in general, but then so much, content because you're talking about this stuff all the time, but there's so many people who want to know, and they want to know someone who's an expert, and guess what? you're the expert, so it's good
Yeah.
stuff.
Yep. Well, I do have a Patreon page, and I'm trying to put more exclusive content on there for Patreon members. And I definitely, another thing I've been doing is I've been doing book reviews for the Journal of Higher Criticism. And most of them have to do with mythicism in some way, shape, or form. So that's some fun things to look out for too.
Isn't there a new mythicism book out? Was it John Loftus?
Oh, how did I not forget that? Yes, there's a new anthology, and I've got a chapter, Why Mythicism Matters, in there by Robert Price and John Loftus. And I make the argument, several arguments, but one of them I make is that no matter which side comes out on this historicist mythicist divide, everything that we learn in back and forth helps us better deal with Christians who are trying to tell us that, oh, they know how Jesus wants us to behave or think or vote. Because by the end of reading that book, I think you'll realize, I hope most people realize that at best, we have to be agnostic about whether there was a real Jesus or not. Because as Robert Price points out, that all our writings that we have that are supposed to be biographies of this guy, they're disconnected from anybody who actually lived in the first century or not. So even if there was a real Jesus, and that's a bit of a stretch in my mind, there isn't one anymore today, because we're not reading anything that he actually said or did, that figure. And that's the kind of things that make mythicism worth
I mean, if you want
arguing over.
If you want an example of like, does religion change? Because the whole idea of religion, they're like, well, we have this morality that doesn't change. When Roe v. Wade passed in like the 70s, and it's might have just been overturned today, the Catholic Church was like, cool. They were like fine with it. And now you can't even be like Christian adjacent and be like pro-choice. And that's changed in 50 years. So what do you think happened in 2,000 years?
Yeah, it was weird that that exact wedge issue was created to be a wedge issue specifically, you know, and as you said, it wasn't a big deal before that. Yeah. Nobody had linked it to Christianity because the Old Testament's got some other funky things to say about infanticide and and just even from a scientific perspective, if you believe that God hates abortion, God is the biggest abortionist in history, just from the amount of miscarriages that have, you know, like I think as high as a third of all normal fertilizations end in miscarriage in one way or another.
It's a big percentage, and there are states like Indiana, they're like making people like bury miscarriages, and like a woman has a miscarriage and they're like getting checked in by the police, and it's like, if you have something that traumatic happen to you, and so many people who have abortions, especially like in the final like 3 months, that's like a life and death situation. It's very traumatic, and to like make them into a criminal because
absolutely, and the amount of hypocrisy on the right,
just
it's
rough.
Like, you think those Republican politicians, when their daughters get pregnant, they don't run out and get a quick abortion? You think those protesters on the abortion lines don't go out and get an abortion and then come right back to the protest lines? Yeah, it's the amount of hypocrisy on that is just off the charts. And like they said,
the way to turn around is make into like a class issue where it's like,
exactly,
yeah, rich people can take care of it, but poor people can't. That's the point.
Exactly.
Like Amy Coney Barrett saying like, it's no big deal to like carry a pregnancy. I'm like,
right?
It's no big deal.
Right?
Like, even if it goes perfully, it's 9 months of your life.
Yeah,
and you have to recover. It's just
very least, yeah.
We don't like the women so much. That's an issue.
And
but
here's the thing. Here's the thing. You can't stop abortion. You can only stop safe abortions. So
yeah, it's not.
And we are well down a rabbit hole. We should not try to.
There are so many rabbit holes. Okay, this is probably a question I shouldn't ask, and it's probably not one you'll be able to answer well. But if you got to talk to Bart Erhman about the subject of mythicism, what's a question you can ask him? Like, do you think you get a good answer out of him? It's probably like, what's a good question, but would he actually answer it is probably even tougher.
Honestly, that would be both a dream and a nightmare, I think, to meet him that way.
Yeah.
I think what I would like to do is write a book, Bart Ehrman versus Bart Ehrman, and take all his writings that support mythicism and use them to debunk all the things he said in favor of historicity, and use that as the conversation starter. Because, like I said, for years I've been saying that for such a staunch anti-mythicist, he's one of the best mythicist researchers out there. And in fact, I think part of the reason his book Did Jesus Exist sucked so bad is because, like he said, he thinks he knows what we're arguing. He doesn't. He stopped listening a long time ago and thinks we're all arguing the same things. And he doesn't realize how much of the mainstream things like Markan priority, like synoptic problem, all these issues, most of the serious mythicists agree on. And the even fact that there's divisions among mythicism and that people like Robert Price and Richard Carrier and myself go after the Joseph Atwills and the Roman Josephine school of early Christianity and point out how these theories just do not add up at all. I don't think he realized that's going on at all. But then again, part of the problem is that nobody on the historicity side seems to be paying much attention to mythicism. And Philip Davies from Sheffield University, who we lost a few years back, he chided Bart Ehrman for this very thing and saying, I don't see mythicism becoming a major thing, not even 20 years. But it's like, hey, we can at least weigh the evidence for him. And it's like, it's ridiculous to see this get poo-pooed because the fragile weight of Jesus could stand to get looked at. And what does it mean to say there definitely was a Jesus when we have so many Jesuses on display for us in the Bible and the New Testament, in extra biblical materials? It's like, it makes no sense to say, oh yeah, there definitely was a guy named Jesus when we can't even pin down who or what that guy was, let alone what our sources are for him. Anyway, I should end my rant there.
there is so much to it, and
so much
the fact that it's like it doesn't really make a career for anybody to be a mythicist. It's like people are really looking into it, and
and that's
people
not going
to know the truth. There are people who are like, I just want to prove it wrong because it would make people mad. But then there are people like,
well, I don't even like discussing mythicism with Christians because it's such a non-starter. I would much rather debate it with an atheist who doesn't agree with it and just let them know where I'm coming from, and kick those tires around and just see how it holds up. But don't straw man me. Don't just laugh at me and say, "Oh, no one thinks that." It's like, dude, I've been hearing that for 20 years. Biblical historians were hearing that 30 years before about other stuff that now they've changed the consensus on.
I mean, in terms of everything, this is an interesting subject that's been discussed for 2,000 years, and there's people who are still coming up with new stuff, and finding new things, and it's never gonna end. But to just make things non-starter stuff.
But on the plus side, it's never going to become the mainstream opinion, I don't think. As long as there's any kind of biblical studies, I think it's always going to be out on the fringe, because the majority of biblical scholarship is by Christians. It's by people who are committed Christians and by people who are contractually obligated to say that they are they are committed Christians in all these different statements of faith that they have to do, and they have to do them, and those are the majority. And it's only getting worse because more and more the only institutions that have biblical studies and Jesus studies and Christian studies are the religious institutions. So the situation for mythicism is always going to be looked askewed by Christian biblical scholars. But we have to look at the arguments. We have to look who's making them, and do they really hold up, and kick the round for bias. But it's not enough to say they're biased or not biased. We have to look at the arguments.
Well, in terms of where do people go if they want to know what's going on with you lately? How to reach you?
Gotcha. You can send your hate mail and love mail. Facebook's probably the easiest place to find me. I've got my email is everybodylovesdave@gmail.com. And I have a website, davefitzgerald.org, that does a pretty good job when I think to update it, of keeping up with what I've been doing lately. And I that's a nice reminder that I need to update with all the stuff that's been going on lately, because there's been an awful lot.
Because the cats aren't doing it.
Because the cats aren't doing it. Yeah.
Well, thanks for being on. Before we call it off, is there anything else? I mean, I know there are so many rabbit holes.
Yeah, I
is
think.
There anything else that I missed that you wanted to cover? Because
we'll save that for next time, because there's always going to be
there is
more.
Always, yeah.
And if you get questions from people, if you get some pushback on any of the things we said tonight, let me know, and we'll address that again, because I'm always happy to talk about this. And it seems like there's always some smug internet dude on Facebook who says, "Oh, this is nothing new. That's or when I love being called a liar, when I'm just a liar." It's like, yeah, that's really helpful. Yeah, let me know. We can respond to that as well.
Sounds great. Well, thank you for being on again, David.
Zach, thanks again, and thanks for everybody who made it all the way through this rant fest. Oh, by the way, Bart Ehrman is going to be doing a series on the Nativity soon, and I think it's going to be awesome. I bet we agree on everything he says for that, because another thing I did recently was
Christmas.
I reviewed his a debate he did back in 2011 on, can we trust the New Testament, or is the Bible historically reliable? And his answer was, no, it's not, and this is why. And I could not agree with him more throughout that. It reminds me why I love the man so much, is because his mythicism work, his work supports mythicism at least as well, if not better, than anything else he's done for historicity.
Perfect. We'll call it a night at that.
All right. Good night, all. Thanks again, and Merry Christ Myth. We'll see you.
Until next time.